together wherever we go, and the showstopper, Rose's Turn, playing August 22nd through September 29th. Ticket information at alhambrajacks.com.
North Florida TPO, proud sponsor of WJCT's First Coast Connect, bringing to the community innovation in transportation planning, commuter services, clean fuels, and intelligent transportation systems. More at northfloridatpo.com.
Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com.
This is WJCT News 89.9 in Jacksonville. Ahead in the next 5 minutes, live local news for the First Coast from the WJCT News team.
Good morning, I'm Dan Scanlon in for Ann Schindler, and this is First Coast Connect. Today the votes are in, so we'll discuss takeaways from last night's primary election and what to look out for in November. Then, the growing need for resiliency in construction as climate incidents like hurricanes take a costly toll on the industries. And a community cookbook highlights the rich diversity of Northeast Florida's beaches. Join the conversation. Give us a call at 904-549-2937. Email us at firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. You can also tag us on Facebook, Instagram, or X. It's all ahead this hour after the day's news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Corva Coleman. Democrats wrapped up the second night of their national convention last night in Chicago. NPR's Asma Khalid reports Vice President Harris and her running mate, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, campaigned yesterday in neighboring Wisconsin.
Harris and Walz rallied voters at the Pfizer Forum in Milwaukee, where just last month, Donald Trump accepted the GOP nomination. And Walz wasn't shy to point that out.
Not only do we have massive energy at our convention, we got a hell of a lot more energy at where they had their convention, right here. Oh, that one guy's going to be so sad tonight, so sad.
Despite the arenas full of people, Harris told the crowd this is going to be a tight race till the end.
This is not just about us versus Donald Trump. This is about two very different visions for our nation.
And she'll have a chance to lay out her vision when she speaks at the convention on Thursday night. Asma Khalid, NPR News.
As Democrats are holding their national convention, former President Donald Trump is campaigning in several swing states. NPR's Danielle Kurtzleben reports he's making the case against Harris using a series of themes, including during his stop yesterday in Michigan.
Trump spoke at a small event in Howell, Michigan, with the theme of crime and safety. Speaking from a county sheriff's department, he talked about boosting funding for law enforcement and providing police with immunity from prosecution. He also cast undocumented immigrants as dangerous sources of crime, at times getting into almost lurid detail as he described violent crimes. Next up, Trump and his running mate J.D. Vance are scheduled to speak about national security in Asheboro, North Carolina. Thursday, Trump is scheduled to be in Arizona, where he'll speak on immigration, and then Friday he'll rally supporters in Las Vegas. Danielle Kurtzleben, NPR News, Charlotte, North Carolina.
Ford is shaping up its plans to build electric vehicles. The automaker says it's going to focus on producing 2 new electric pickup trucks and a commercial van. Ford is now dropping its plans to build fully electric 3-row SUVs. The mayor of Moscow says Russia has fended off at least 10 Ukrainian drone attacks on the capital. The rare Moscow strikes were part of a 40-drone attack by Ukraine that Russia says it repelled overnight. The attacks come as Ukrainian troops advance in Russia's Kursk region, seizing several hundred miles of land. Pentagon spokesman Major General Pat Ryder says Russia has not been quick to respond.
We have seen indications of Russia moving a small number of forces into Kursk. The Kursk region to respond. I would say, generally speaking, though, Russia has really struggled to respond.
But Russian troops are advancing in a different part of eastern Ukraine, and Ukrainian troops have also had to pull back there. You're listening to NPR.
And good morning. It's 4 minutes after 9 o'clock. I'm Michelle Corum. This is WJCT News 89.9 in Jacksonville. Yesterday, Florida Representative Tom Leake defeated two challengers in the Republican primary for Senate District 7. That represents St. Johns, Putnam, Flagler, and part of Volusia counties. Leake and former St. Johns County Sheriff David Shore faced off. Leake garnered about 35,000 votes. Shore trailed with nearly 21,000 votes. Challenger Jerry James had more than 19,000. College football is back. The Florida A&M Rattlers take on the Norfolk State Spartans in the HBCU season opener in Atlanta this Saturday. FAMU's head coach, James Colsey III, anticipates a back-and-forth bout between the two teams.
It's going to be their first game as well. We're not going to have all our numbers and, percentages and, tendencies and stuff like that. So, you could easily have two teams in the beginning of a game trying to figure each one of us out.
Saturday's game kicks off at 7:30 p.m. on ABC. FAMU goes into the season as the Black College national champion, having won the Celebration Bowl in Atlanta last December. In Jacksonville now, it's 80 degrees. It's humid, very cloudy. Showers and pop-up storms are likely, especially between 3 and 5 p.m. It's going to be sunny, up to 90 degrees this afternoon and down to the mid-70s tonight. Tomorrow, there's a 60% chance of rain.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Mill, the food recycler that turns peels, bones, and leftovers into dry grounds for gardens. Or Mill can get them back to a farm. It's built to be odorless and runs automatically at night. More at mill.com.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided in part by Baptist Health and North Florida TPO.
And good morning, I'm Dan Scanlon in for Ann Schindler, and this is First Coast Connect. Well, today the votes are in, and we're going to discuss the big winners, the unsuccessful bids, and the potential local and state impacts as Florida gears up for its pivotal role in the upcoming November presidential election. Then later in the program, the growing need for resiliency in the construction industry. But first, Florida's primary, yay, is over. Now the real fun begins with 76 days left till the November election. Political expert and local government attorney Chris Hand joins us with all the takeaways. Good morning, Chris.
Dan, great to see you.
It is great to be here with you. Now, I guess the first comment, and I noticed this when I came in last night at 6 o'clock and started looking, we're looking at 19% overall voter turnout in most of Northeast Florida's counties. St. Johns County, 24%. Jerry Holland earlier this week had said it was going to be low. No excitement? What are your thoughts about the fact that we were 20% less or just a skosh more?
Well, you're absolutely right, Dan. I mean, given this was an election that effectively decided control of the Duval County School Board and other school boards throughout the region, effectively decided who's going to serve in certain Florida legislative seats, it was a very impactful election. But as you say, we had a total turnout, I think, of 19.83% here in Duval County. It was similarly low, not just throughout Northeast Florida, but this was a phenomenon we saw throughout the state. I think there's probably a variety of factors that contribute to that. One, there is, I think, still a general kind of concern, alienation from politics that many feel, and that sort of sometimes dissuades people from voting. I think the calendar might have something to do about it. Unlike other states that have their primaries in March or April or May, or then after Labor Day. Of course, ours is in the last 10 days of August. I think that probably discourages people as well. So I think this is a function. Look, our most fundamental form of effective citizenship is voting, deciding who our next leaders are going to be. It's incumbent that everybody, from citizens to elected officials to candidates, try and encourage people to get out there and cast their ballot. Given how impactful the November general election is going to be, it's imperative that we as a community do better than 19.83% when people go to the polls on November 5th and during early voting.
And is this in spite of or because of all of the heavy pack advertisements that had me reaching for the mute button because I was so tired of hearing some of the things that as a journalist I knew were somewhat untrue?
I don't think that helps at all. I mean, that sort of style of campaigning, I think there, are a number of voters who kind of say a pox on all your houses, and we're simply not gonna come out and cast ballots because they're turned off by the tenor, the sort of style of these campaigns, and in some cases, how negative and destructive they've become. So that certainly isn't a helpful factor in this. I think it's one of a variety of factors, but we've seen this trend in recent years. I remember having almost this exact same conversation 2 years ago in 2022. Turnout was a little bit better then. It was kind of in the low 20s, but a similar phenomenon. So I think it's something that we here in the state of Florida need to take a very close look at. How can we help increase participation in these primaries? One comment I heard last night is, of course, during these primaries, there's one very significant group of voters that are shut out of many of them, and those are NPA or no party affiliation voters. They're the fastest growing group of voters in the state. While they can vote in nonpartisan races like the school board or judges, races like that, they cannot vote when primaries are closed in races for the Florida legislature or other contests where candidates have D or R. So I wonder if this could revive some talk about how to give no party affiliation voters more of a way to participate in these primaries.
And if you couldn't have your say yesterday, might you just say the heck with it come November? That because you've been shut out, so that may, Jerry Holland indicated it's going to be standing room only come precinct time in November, but there just might be some percentage that says, hey, you didn't want me back in August, the heck with you.
Well, I certainly hope not. And I think every election is its own election, and the dynamics are very different from a November general election and an August primary. I think, when you get to November, there's sort of a liturgy to voting at that time of year. People are accustomed to it. The stakes are obviously very high. We're electing a new president of the United States. We're electing a U.S. senator, variety of other races on the ballot. So I know Supervisor Holland has predicted a large turnout. You hear that from other supervisors around the state as well. I think it will be a much more robust turnout in November. But I think sometimes this August primary is unfortunately overlooked, and it's hugely impactful. We now have a very good sense of what representation on the Duval County School Board, one of the most important forms of local government, is going to be. We now have a good sense of who's going to represent certain districts in the Florida legislature. What happened last night was very important. In the future, we've got to figure out ways to encourage and motivate turnout.
Hey, don't forget, we want to get your phone calls, so give us a yell at 904-549-2937. And we have our first call. Susan in Mandarin, good morning. Your question.
Yes, I was wondering if each school board district has the same number of voters, because a lot more people voted in School Board District 7 than voted in Duval School Board District 3. And it may actually be tied to what y'all said about, because I know a lot of negative mailers went out in District 3, and I wonder if that suppressed some of the vote. And Sarah Mannion actually got more votes than Cindy Pearson, but because more people voted in District 7, she lost. If you allow me another really quick question, do you think that during these August elections, when Jerry Holland sends out the sample ballot, it should say primary and school board elections and judges elections, because some MPAs didn't know they could vote in the school board election. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, even I was questioning yesterday as I'm writing up some advance copy as to who gets to vote when and where. I don't know. I've been registered forever. I know when and where, and I'm lucky enough I had the supervisor election sitting here 2 days ago to ask questions.
Well, I think very good questions on Susan's part. To her first question about, the number of citizens in each district, we have 7 school board districts in Duval County. Each one is comprised of 2 city council districts. And so, yes, there's a relatively comparable, not the exact number in every district, but a comparable number of voters in each of those districts. As to the sample ballot and how that's presented, that's really something outside of Supervisor Holland's control. That's really decided at the state level how this particular election is labeled. It's always been labeled as the primary election, even if party primaries are not the only issue on the ballot. Because, again, even if there aren't party primaries, some of these elections are not decided in August. So, for example, in the contest for School Board District 5, there were 3 candidates. None of them received a majority, and so the top 2 finishers will advance to the November runoff.
40% and 40.8 or 40.9, I think, is what I saw this morning. So that's I looked, it was like a handful of votes between them. What about the issues? I mean, some school board districts had major campaigns going to save some of their schools that were initially destined for departure. Others have seen some brand new schools or combined schools. So they're more, the schools are more in their minds these days. And also there's parents who are finding out that the buses don't work that well this year. And I can claim that from, on our end too, with our family. So some people are more school oriented in some parts of town than others, and that may have driven them to the polls to vote for who they think can fix the problem.
Well, I mean, Dan, you're absolutely right that this was a very high-stakes election for the Duval County School Board, because you think about what Duval County Public Schools, they're very much at a pivot point. There's obviously a brand-new superintendent, Dr. Christopher Bernier, who started on July the 1st. The school system is grappling with some very big challenges right now. Funding challenges that are occasioned by a lot of factors, changes in state law, declining enrollment, inflation, as you just alluded to, a school facilities challenge. Back in 2000, voters passed a $2 billion school renovation and construction plan for a number of reasons, including inflation and costs. The deficit in school facilities plan is now $1.5 billion. So they're talking about potentially having to close schools. That's a huge conversation, in addition to the typical conversations about student achievement and student attendance. So this was a very high-stakes election for the school board, and obviously in some districts, folks really responded to that.
Well, we're getting a lot of phone calls here, so let's go to Felix in Jacksonville Beach. You have a comment.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Okay, yeah, the guy, the person you're talking to, I love what he's saying, but, we can make as many excuses as we want why the turnout is low, but 19% is an absolute disgrace. And furthermore, if you listen to Michelle Obama last night, is everybody's got to do something. Your one vote really counts. And stop. If you have one issue, the people who don't have an affiliate party, they must have an issue on something that they want to vote on. They can't just throw up their hands and go, well, nobody wants us. That's nonsense. Take the one issue and vote for the Democrat or the Republican. Otherwise, you're just not doing anything for your community. Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, I think he raises an excellent point. I've spent a number of years working on the issue of effective citizenship with my good friend and mentor, the late former governor and Senator Bob Graham.
Mm-hmm.
And we've always said in that process that the most important role in American democracy is that of citizen. But that role matters only if you build and flex your citizenship muscles. So I think the caller raises an excellent point. It's not enough to have the title of citizen. We actually have to go out and use that title. The most fundamental form of citizenship is to go out and cast a ballot in every election that you're in which you're eligible to cast a ballot, so that you can choose kind of who's going to lead your community and represent you in a particular office.
It used to be that I didn't want to vote, I didn't want to register. Oh my gosh, I'm going to be on jury duty. Well, there's my I voted from yesterday, and I'm proud to do it because it's part of the process. I'm somewhat of an insider. I get to talk to people like you and learn these things. So let's talk about some of the stuff that maybe you can really comment on. Let's start with the school board race.
Sure.
Was there an effect with having endorsements by the governor?
Well, I think we saw this around the state last night. I mean, compared to 2022, there was a very mixed record of success for the governor's endorsement. So if you look at 2022, the governor made 34 endorsements in school board races. All but 5 of those candidates won. 2 years is a long time in politics. A lot has happened since then. So last night was a very kind of mixed record. I think the governor endorsed 23 school board candidates around the state. 6 won, 11 lost. Others are headed to November runoff, so still to be determined what happens there. And again, it was a mixed record here. There were 2 school board candidates the governor endorsed who won, Tony Ricardo in District 1 and Melody Baldick in District 7. But there was one candidate that he didn't endorse and that he actually put on a list of school board members he wanted to defeat as long as a year ago. That was Cindy Pearson in District 3, who won her race. So it was a very mixed record for the governor, won a couple of races, but probably the most high-profile race, the one that attracted the most attention, the candidate he supported did not win. Incumbent Cindy Pearson was reelected.
And what about the Moms for Liberty effect, which has been in the news a lot in Duval County? even prior to the election.
Sure.
Your thoughts?
Well, I think very similar to the governor, sort of mixed record, both here locally and around the state in terms of that phenomenon and its ability to translate into electoral office. There were a couple of candidates who I think were sort of Moms for Liberty affiliated who won, one who did not. And it'll be interesting to see how the new school board comes together on a variety of these issues. But again, very different result from 2022, which I think just goes to prove every election is its own election. You can't immediately extrapolate from a prior election and say this is what's going to happen in the future. You have to take each election as a new one, and we certainly saw that last night.
Got some phone calls stacking up here. So, Chris, on the northwest side of town, your comment.
Well, I was calling because I'm registered a non-party affiliated, and when I received my sample ballot, the only thing that was on the ballot were judges' races. So I felt very, closed away from the races. And as a veteran, I usually vote at, every opportunity I get, but I felt really closed down in my ability to vote, and I felt very, turned off by all the negative ads and mailers and no positivity, no substance as to what these candidates are going to do, as opposed to what the other person, is bad at.
All right, thank you. Well, that's what I said earlier. Here's a voter who feels turned off now. He'll probably, from the sound of him, vote in November, but it's a bummer if you can't exercise your right and you don't really know why, I guess.
Well, Chris raises an excellent point about the way that no party affiliation voters are effectively prevented from voting in a number of contests. That's why I talked about earlier. Certain of these races, particularly for the Florida legislature and others, are effectively decided in August. So someone like Chris, who's a no party affiliation voter, really won't have much of a chance or an effective chance to weigh in on who a state representative or state senator might be going forward. There have been a number of different discussions for particular ways to reform the system. One option would be right here in the city of Jacksonville for our city elections. We use what's called a unitary system where all candidates run on the ballot regardless of party affiliation, and the top two finishers, if no one gets a majority, go to a next round. All voters can vote in those elections. So NPAs can vote in every city election. There have been suggestions about applying something like that or something like what's called an open primary, where NPA voters can choose to vote in either the Democratic or the Republican primary when those are happening. So there have been those kind of calls for reform, and I think it's really important the state take a look at that, because I think Chris raises a good point, Dan, that you just expounded upon, which is when people are denied the ability to vote, they can lose the interest in voting, or become even more alienated or jaded about participating in the electoral process. We ought to have an election system that encourages people to vote and gives them the power to vote as many times as possible.
Well, let's go back to some of the school board races here. We've got District 1, Nadine Embry versus Tony Ricardo. Some would say that Embry is the more qualified. There was some questions about Mr. Ricardo, so break that down for a minute.
Sure. This was, a race in District 1. Kelly Coker was the incumbent school board member elected not to run for a second term. Very robust contest. Ended up being a close contest at the end of the day. Mr. Ricardo ended up winning by, 7 or 8 points last night on Election Day. He was one of the governor's endorsed candidates. I think that's why these low turnout elections are, sometimes these endorsements can kind of make a difference in that. Dr. Embry ran a very robust campaign, sort of very issue-focused. But again, it was low turnout. Mr. Ricardo able to marshal, some of the forces that were supporting his campaign to achieve about a 6 to 7% win.
Then we've got District 3. We've already talked about Cindy Pearson versus Becky Nathanson, and that was a little close there as the numbers were clicking in, but eventually a small but definitive lead for Cindy.
Yeah, that was of all four school board races, that was the one that was most high profile. Cindy Pearson was the incumbent, and really an onslaught of advertising. If you live in District 3, you've received a lot of communications, mail pieces, other forms of communication about that race. A lot of money invested in that race in an attempt to defeat the incumbent, Cindy Pearson. I think one of the keys to her victory, and as of last night, that was 294 votes this morning, but they've counted some final ballots. It's gone up to about 500. One of the keys to her victory was what I'll call the everything, everywhere, all at once strategy, which is she has been a very active and engaged school board member. She's seen all throughout the district all the time. And the benefit of that approach to governing and to campaigning is you really do develop relationships with your constituents and families in the district. I think at the end of the day, that might have been the decisive factor in that race, how present she has been as a school board member, her level of activity, both as a member and as a candidate.
And then District 7, Melody Bolduc versus Sarah Mannion. Any thoughts on that?
I think similar dynamics to some extent to the District 1 race, although, Melody Bolduc had this was not her first run for the school board. She had run back in 2016 as well, so kind of long had been sort of working toward this outcome, sort of building toward that. But I think similar dynamics as well. The governor endorsed her, low turnout race. That certainly, I think, was of some benefit in that, and she ended up winning by, I think, about a double-digit margin in that particular district. So these school board races are very important. This is one area of local government that just touches everybody, whether that's students, whether that's parents, whether that's families, whether that's taxpayers, whether that's teachers. Everybody is impacted by what happens in these school board races. So really critical contest on the ballot last night.
Before we jump into some of the legislative races, let's take another phone call. Eric from Arlington, you're on the air.
Yeah, just briefly, there's been this trend, particularly in Florida, of moving toward allowing or having suburban religious mothers who are somehow now suddenly experts in public health and education, toward them having a say in how we educate our children, with the banning of books. In Louisiana, we have the Ten Commandments in the schools. And then also I forget what the other thing was that they were doing. But, are we in danger of losing our accreditation in Florida? I know what it was, that we're not teaching real history when it comes to African Americans in particular. Are we at any point ever in danger of losing our accreditations in our public schools due to all this nonsense? Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know how to answer that, because that has to come from a higher authority. One would think the Federal Department of Education would have to take a look and might even have to be invited to do so.
Well, there are a variety of accreditation authorities. I don't know that anyone has, expressed concern at that point that is something that is in the offing. But I will say, the phenomenon the gentleman describes, which you kind of asked about earlier, which is sort of the emergence of the Moms for Liberty in Florida over the last several years. Like I said earlier, it was a very sort of mixed record last night. There were a bunch of candidates that the governor and groups like Moms for Liberty supported who lost around the state. Governor DeSantis had had suspended a couple of members, for example, of the Broward County School Board down in South Florida, appointed two people. Both of those candidates lost last night. The three candidates he supported in Pinellas County, I think some or all of them were also Moms for Liberty supported, also lost last night. So it was a very mixed record. I think there's been some backlash because of some of the very issues that our caller raises, whether that's concerns about book banning or removing books from lists, some of the reteaching of history that the caller described, other factors as well. So again, that's why, 2 years is a long time in politics. Whatever happened in 2022, events since then, I think, have rebalanced the electorate a little bit, and that's why we saw these kind of mixed results last night across the state.
And the voters sometimes have very good memories. If something happens in the next 2 years that they don't like with the candidate, they will remember that. And they, as we have seen in the past 2 years, they get on the soapbox and they start griping about it, and they become a pundit. They become a person who is seen on TV griping about things. So let's take Stanley from the north. Let's take Todd from Riverside. Todd, you're on the air. Todd?
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to, hello?
Yes, you're there. Go ahead.
To get your all's comments along the lines of, NPA voters being discouraged and ranked choice voting, and how the current state administration sort of already shut that down compared to other states. Thanks.
Thank you.
It's an excellent question, because as the caller notes, there are a number of states out there that have utilized ranked choice voting very effectively. The state of Alaska does it. In Maine, they have ranked choice voting. They've used it for elections in New York City as well. it's an option that a lot of voters like there. It also has the benefit of being somewhat taxpayer friendly because you can have both your original election and your runoff at the exact same time, essentially, because people do their ranked choice. As the caller points out, it is not currently an option in the state of Florida because the legislature has foreclosed local communities from doing that, and of course done so at the state level as well. But I think ought to be in that sort of basket of reform ideas that we consider, along with kind of the unitary system and the the open primary type approach. Again, anything we can do to encourage as many voters as possible, to give as many voters as possible access to the process and encourage them to participate in the process is an idea that ought to be considered.
And we've got Stanley from the north side on the air. Stanley, your comment or question?
Yes. First of all, Chris, man, you're a fair and balanced. My main point, Chris, I wish you would take the time out to have a workshop concerning voting, the Q&A, because why are the numbers decreasing when you have an increase in population when it comes to voting? Thank you.
Thank you. That's an interesting comment. Are maybe less people registering to vote when they come into their county or whatever county?
Well, I mean, look, we have roughly 1 million people who live here in the city of Jacksonville, Duval County. There are about 630,000 registered voters in this county. So you have a large number of registered voters. Obviously, there always, I think, ought to be a push to register more and make sure people who are eligible are registered, and that's incumbent on political parties and others involved in the process to make sure we're encouraging people to register. But I think what we saw last night was that huge gap between the number of people who were registered to vote and the number of people who actually did vote. 8 in 10 voters who were registered did not vote in the August primary, and that's with the opportunity to vote by mail, with almost a week and a half of early voting, and of course Election Day voting itself. So I really do think we've got to kind of get down to the root causes of exactly why is that happening and figure out how to address that.
Well, Michael emailed us, diminished turnout is expected collateral damage from negative and deceptive campaigning. This is intentional, he says. And then Ricardo's email, looks like the ghost candidate strategy in St. Johns County Commission election backfired on a couple of incumbents. So karma for election interference. Interesting, both commenting. Now, let's talk about the and this is not intended as a pun, the elephant in the room. In the Senate District 7 Republican primary, the majority of the ads that we saw were between Tom Leak and David Shore, many from PACs firing back at each other versus Jerry James. And in the end, we've got Leak way over the former sheriff, who seems to have suffered by being third. Your thoughts about that? I mean, that was the one that literally I was reaching for the mute button after a while.
Well, if you were a voter in District 7 who didn't know about that state Senate race, it means you have not been watching television or checking your mail or your text messages for the last several months. As you say, a massive investment of dollars there. And, I'm also affiliated with WJCT, and my colleague Rick Mullaney put it very well on the air last night. There were a series of proxy battles going on in that campaign that actually had very little to do with some of the issues facing voters in Senate District 7. One, as Rick put it very well, was a proxy battle between kind of the insurance industry and trial lawyers. Tom Leak, who was the victor last night, current state representative, has been aligned with the insurance industry, was a leader on efforts to achieve tort reform, kind of lawsuit limitations in the Florida legislature. Obviously, that is a position not supported by, civil justice trial attorneys. So they invested heavily in David Shore. That was one proxy battle that sent a ton of money into that district. Another was, to some extent, as Rick described, a proxy battle between Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis. Tom Leak was supported by Ron DeSantis and largely the leadership of the Florida legislature. David Shore, the former St. Johns County sheriff, was endorsed on Truth Social by former President Donald Trump. So that was another proxy battle. Now, the challenge with those proxy battles sometimes is a lot of the issues that they care about are not necessarily the ones impacting voters. And as we know, District 7 is one of the fastest growing areas of the state. St. John's, Flagler, Volusia counties, they're dealing with issues from affordable housing to property insurance rates to infrastructure, a variety of issues there. Those got less attention in this campaign than some others because of these proxy battles that were
But
occurring.
yet things like mass transit and possibly the rail line from Jacksonville to St. Augustine, I would think would be a top priority for a state lawmaker to work with the locals on, so that we get that dream of that transportation link. How about House District 13, that Democratic primary with Angie Nixon versus Brenda Priestley Jackson, with the Corinne Brown legal action thrown in last week? I actually saw video of Angie Nixon dancing when she got the news. And so obviously there's a belief that the grassroots won out here.
Well, I think this, like District 3 and the school board side, this is another example of how an incumbent forms a relationship with the constituents. Angie Nixon is one of the hardest working elected officials around, is in and about her district all the time. Like I said, forged relationships there. This contest was thought very early on to be one that might be very closely contested. Angie Nixon, the incumbent Florida member of the Florida House of Representatives, she was opposed by Brenda Priestley Jackson, who's a former Duval County School Board member, former Jacksonville City Council member. There was thought early on that this could be a very close contest. It ended up not being, as Angie Nixon won re-election with 81% of the vote last night.
Yeah, and don't forget that equal-faced Democrat George T. Hill, and Angie still has to face write-in candidate Terrence Jordan in November. So there's the potential for some more campaigning going on. Let's just look ahead. We have about 2-3 more minutes left. Let's look ahead to November. Obviously, we're in the middle of the DNC right now. We're seeing a pitched battle between the new Democratic presidential candidate and the former President Donald Trump. And what do you think about Florida as we come in for the next 76 days? And then I'll ask you, who do you think is going to be stronger in Florida?
Well, I think the next 76 days are going to be a very good barometer of where Florida stands as a battleground state. In recent elections, most famously in the 2000 election where Florida was literally decisive in the presidential election, it has been one of those swing states. Because of results in recent years, Florida's kind of slid off that list of swing states a little bit. But I think there are some signs that it could be more closely contested than people think. Since Kamala Harris became the de facto Democratic nominee about a month ago, there's been some polling taken that shows Donald Trump leading in the state by somewhere between 2 and 5 points. And so there are some signs that the Harris campaign may make more of a robust effort here than the Biden campaign had originally planned to do so. So we're going to have to watch that carefully. I do think one media market that will unquestionably see activity, regardless of what happens in the rest of the state, is right here in Jacksonville. As you know well, because your listeners are not just in Florida, but in South Georgia, and the same is true for every television station in this market, that they have Floridians and Georgians watching them. Because Georgia is unquestionably a swing state and because Florida might be, I think there'll be a lot of activity in this market. And I suspect we will see either the principals or key surrogates coming here to the state. There's some infrastructure issues in terms of voter registration and turnout that could impact this, but it does appear like Florida is going to be contested in some form or fashion. How much we'll know over the next 76 days.
And what about those constitutional amendments? There's certainly been, especially with one of them, a lot of back and forth about the marijuana bill, sheriffs, mayors, governors, president. It's been all sorts of yes or no. So your thoughts on amendments 1, 3, and 4?
One of the most potentially impactful slate of constitutional amendments in the last 25 years here in Florida. Amendment 4, which would restore reproductive freedom in the Florida Constitution, the right to abortion, which the governor and the legislature, passed their 6-week ban. Amendment 3, which would legalize small amounts of recreational marijuana here in the state. And Amendment 1, which would require that school board elections are partisan, that they have to have D or R after the name. That would be a reversal of a decision that voters made in 1998 when they decided that school board elections should be nonpartisan. So please educate yourself about those amendments if you're listening to this. Very impactful. Could have impacts in other races beyond just the amendment campaigns themselves.
And quickly, Chris, with about a minute left, what does this say, the results yesterday, say about former presidential candidate, now governor for 2 more years, Ron DeSantis?
Well, I think it says that, again, and this is not uncommon in a second gubernatorial term, that he may not, his political high water mark in the state is probably passed. It's happened to every second-term governor. It's not unique to him. But as opposed to 2022, when he won every race up and down the ballot, won re-election with almost 60% of the vote, because of the unsuccessful presidential campaign, maybe because this is just what happens to second-term governors. His standing and his political brand are maybe not what they once were, doesn't have the same coattails to help carry candidates across the line. Again, it's a tale as old as time. We've seen it again and again here in Florida politics, not necessarily unique just to Governor DeSantis.
We don't know what he might be going for next. He's still a pretty young guy.
Correct. Yeah. No, he probably does have an interest in serving in office in the future. We'll see how that plays out in the years to come.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the program. Nice to finally talk with you. Chris Hand, rains and the winds and the flooding coming from hurricanes and then earthquakes elsewhere. It's an increasing cost for the construction industry, causing project delays and billions in extra costs and lost income. And with adverse weather impacting nearly half of global construction projects, have people been building resiliency into construction become a priority? Well, you've heard about this on this show from the mayor, from the city's resiliency expert. It's time to go to the folks who have to build this stuff. So welcome to Tyler Mathews, president of England-Thims Miller.
Good morning. Good to see you.
Good morning. Here we are on the St. Johns River in this studio, and I've been told stories that during Irma, the water was coming up near us.
Absolutely.
I know that the parking garage of the Four Seasons nearby is part of a resiliency effort. It will take the flood waters as the hotel is higher. I know that obviously the old landing site is now being built and they're putting walls for resiliency. And I've also seen what the rising waters do in San Marco and right down the road at Memorial Park. So I guess we've been using the word resiliency a lot of late. And now let's talk to the people who have to build it into the projects. Last October, Mayor Deegan and Chief Resiliency Officer Ann Colgianci launched Resilient Jacksonville. It's a 50-year resilience strategy for the city. So how do you define resiliency in the context of construction, and why has it become more important?
Absolutely. Good. Well, huge NPR fan, and Dan, thank you for having us. So when I think of resiliency, and I'm so glad you spoke to Mayor Deegan and then the Chief Resiliency Officer, Anna Coglianese, they're both doing great work on this topic. I actually zoomed back out for this morning and said, okay, what's the dictionary tell me? And so the core definition of resiliency is the capacity to withstand or recover quickly from difficulties, right? It's our resiliency. And so when we look at how that's being adapted, and we're engineer of record on everything from the FIS building to the Four Seasons to more suburban neighborhoods like Nocatee or Wildlight, which are new cities, and everywhere where we're looking now, this topic is coming up. And it's interesting because the core place that we think about it is around hydrology or rainwater or flooding. But if you speak with Anna, the definition is much more broad. It includes heat. It includes social resiliency. And so it's a fascinating topic that you really always have to ask somebody, what do you mean when you say resiliency? Because it can include so many different components.
Well, what I've talked about on the show and as a reporter here, you're right. Not only are we talking about floodwaters, rainwaters coming in, we're talking about adding more tree cover.
Yep.
I've heard a new term this year about heat-resistant asphalt.
Absolutely.
So that I guess the heat isn't radiating from underneath. And the fact that we've had to open cooling centers this year is another step in resiliency because the population needs a place to go if their AC isn't there or if their power fails. So what's the difference between resiliency and sustainability?
Absolutely.
You got to build it in and it's got to last a while, I guess. So that's the sustainability.
It does. Yeah. So sustainability would be the component of, can we continue to do something for generations to come? Right. And so that's where we think about renewable materials in buildings, like building something with stick frame, timber, as opposed to building something with concrete, different building types. So that would be more sustainability. To resiliency is our ability to react and handle these big weather events. And, it's interesting because when you really look today at how we're designing things, it is coming to effect. And so I look at it and say, good data and good science, and then ultimately good design off that good data is how we prevent this going forward. And it's one great project at a time as we move forward.
So what does it mean to the bottom line? Obviously, you have to build buildings up. You have to build absorptive. You have to build heat resistant. You have to consider landscaping and trees and gravel and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. So, from the bottom line, right, these things cost money, but it's definitely an ROI calculation on, so I'm thinking when we were working with Hines, who was the master developer of the new FIS building, and we were doing a resiliency study with a resiliency specialist, and we're debating, exactly how high should the finished floor of the FIS building be right there adjacent to the St. Johns River. And this happened to be right after Irma, so you had fresh data. And ultimately, as an owner, they're running this calculus on how much am I willing to invest to keep driving the building up for the, the insurance, if you will, that it won't flood, versus how many millions does it cost me for these few extra inches.
And that's the other end of the line. If your facility, if what you've designed is damaged, and we have seen some serious damage since Irma, some people abandon the project because they don't want to. And insurance companies are vacating Florida because of the insurance issues. So how do you build and absorb those costs? And is that after the fact cost?
Yep, absolutely.
A factor.
And it's so hard, right? I mean, you're sitting there making a decision today. It's easy to see the spreadsheet and see what it's going to cost me today to add that 1 foot to this building or address this living shoreline. It's much harder to do a risk analysis and say, hey, 10, 15, 20 years from now, if my building floods and then my tenant leaves, what does that look like? Right. And so it's cost today versus risk in the future. And that's the equation. You look at what happened in Irma with the Wells Fargo Tower.
You read my mind literally,
right, I mean,
because I ended up working there. Yes. And so went the computer system, and for 3-6 months, that building was unusable because they had to fix that infrastructure.
Absolutely. And I think, I'm very proud of where we are as a city now, because I do believe that, again, one great project at a time, we're addressing this issue. And it's everything from the Four Seasons and the FIS building and how they're being built to what the city's doing on the Riverwalk to pump stations in San Marco. And so, these are, one infrastructure investment at a time is how you keep addressing this issue.
The two things that come to mind, though, is that you build up to protect your property. You build systems underneath to handle the floodwater. How do you make that look pretty? To me, the Four Seasons, I don't know what it's going to look like, but I envision a very pretty tower and other facilities on top of something. And then you add landscaping, and that landscaping and the systems there have to be able to flow the water to someplace where it is held and then put back into the river. That's going to cost, and that's going to also be ugly to some.
Well, so
or how do you make it pretty?
It's funny. We joke a lot internally. So I'm a licensed engineer, and we talk often internally in our building on, hey, nobody cares what the engineers do because it's all buried underground. They care what the landscape architects and the planners and the architects do, because that's what they see every day. And so when we look at what we're doing, from how you handle the stormwater to how you handle the flow, you've got to hide it. You have to make it aesthetically pleasing. Or if you see it, you've got to amenitize it. And so it's interesting when you talk somewhere, you're talking about San Marco for a second. In that community, if we were building that today, if that were greenfield like it was in the 20s, and then we were wiping it to build the square, we would have way more ponds. We would have way bigger pipes or box culverts compared to what is there today. And so the reality is this component of we don't build it how we used to. I always say, thank God, because we're building stuff with way more science and way better now.
And what about the fact that as you're building or others are building these structures to handle the resiliency effort, where does the water go? It goes to the poor guy whose building's been there for 60 years next door, and you're just throwing water back at that person, or maybe not, but that's a belief in some cases that the water's got to go somewhere.
The perception, well, and that's true, right? The water has to go somewhere. The perception is you're just flooding the neighbor. Not always true, I think. But back to urban redevelopment, you think of the brand new Publix in San Marco that we were engineer on. Today, when we were designing that, the stormwater pipe in the road in Atlantic Boulevard in front of us, it was literally full of water because it was backed up to the river in one big pipe that drained that whole neighborhood.
Yeah, people need to realize that when the high tide comes on a king tide with a rainstorm, that the manhole covers in San Marcos Square are bubbling. Already. The water's bubbling out, and it's river water. Now we have a project going in that will assist that, but unfortunately, that was the flooding point 2 weeks ago because that construction was still happening. Ultimately, that pump will be back on board.
It will be.
And the pump that's sitting at the next street corner will not be there. Well, I want to thank you very much for being here. It is time to go talk about some other stuff. But Tyler Mathews, thanks about talking about resiliency. Coming up next, a community cookbook that showcases the rich diversity of Northeast Florida's beaches through
healthcare for the working uninsured for over 20 years. With over 200 dedicated medical volunteers, Volunteers in Medicine operates clinics in West Jax and South San Marco. We're committed to a healthier community. More at VIMJax.org.
North Florida TPO, proud sponsor of WJCT's First Coast Connect, bringing to the community innovation in transportation planning, commuter services, clean fuels, and intelligent transportation systems. More at northfloridatpo.com.
On the next Fresh Air, how one investigative reporter says Donald Trump has changed federal law enforcement. David Rode argues that since 2016, Trump has used conspiracy theories, co-option, and threats to bend Justice Department and FBI officials to his will. Rhodes' new book is Where Tyranny Begins. Join us.
Today at noon on WJCT News 89.9.
Vice presidential candidates Tim Walz and J.D. Vance are both hyping their Midwestern identities.
We're white guys from the Midwest. I guess there are similarities there. But what's different is the actual ideas about how best to serve people, white, black, or anything else, in the Midwest and everywhere else.
I'm Tiziana Deering. Midwestern identity in politics today. That's on the next On Point.
Today at 11, here on WJCT News 89.9.
The United States has one of the safest water supplies in the world. That's the good news for most, but not all. Millions have good reason not to trust what comes out of their tap. Next time on 1A, we ask the EPA what's being done to fix a system that in places is said to be on the verge of collapse.
Today, starting at 10 on WJCT News 89.9.
And we are back, and I'm never happier than when I'm talking about food, and that's what we're going to be talking about. Daddle pepper jelly, bear's head hash, and wedding punch from the Skull family. Just a few of the recipes featured in a new community cookbook that celebrates the diverse flavors and cooks of our beaches community, a favorite place that I like to go to eat. So joining us to talk about cocktails and cookbooks, the launch party for the Beaches Community Cookbook, A Taste of Home, is Jacksonville Beach Mayor and Jacksonville Beach Historical Society head Christine Hoffman, and Katie Ryder, owner of Morgan Mackenzie Design, the designer of the Beaches Community Cookbook.
Good morning.
Welcome. Good morning. You know,
Good morning.
I think of shrimp, ceviche. I think of shrimp tacos. I think of taco lu when I talk about beaches food. But, you know, as St. Augustine has Menorcan heritage, we have a lot of heritage at our beach. So let's just open it up. This is a Cocktails and Cookbooks, Beaches Community Cookbook, A Taste of Home. It takes readers on a culinary journey through Northeast Florida's diverse history. So what inspired the creation of this book?
So the Beaches Historical Society started off in 1979, and very early on, they put together a community cookbook in the early 80s, and it was their biggest fundraiser. It had, you know, really the ladies of the Beaches Society submitted recipes. We also had recipes from what are now long lost restaurants, such as Le Chateau.
Oh, yes.
So it was a huge fundraiser and project for the society at the time, and we have had a lot of people over the years asking for us to bring it back. So when we decided to do a culinary history exhibit for the Beaches Museum, which we had earlier this year, we decided it was the perfect time to bring back the cookbook. So we went back to that original cookbook, took out some of those recipes, brought those forward, and then we went to some of the recipes of restaurants that we have lost in the meantime. So since the original cookbook, such as First Street Grill. Speaking of shrimp, we have the shrimp tomato basil recipe, which was a big hit. We have Strickland's shrimp gumbo. So we have there's a lot of shrimp in this cookbook, as you can imagine, from something that is all about the beach's culinary history. So
And you've named some places near and dear to my heart, having lived here for 40 plus years. I actually ate at Le Chateau with my father, who was a head chef, and he appreciated it as well. So, yeah, I make food. I cook food. I eat local. That's the bottom line. So let's just talk about the museum has displays, and they show some of the recipes. Some are the new ones, and they're marked one way. Some are the classic ones from this bigger book that I'm tapping right now. How did you select recipes to showcase to get people hungry, I guess?
So I would say when we did the exhibit, we really wanted to do a diversity. The Bear's Head hash is representative of the Timucuan history. We have daddle pepper. We do have Menorcan influence here. The real coup, I think, of not only that Beaches Bite by Bite exhibit, but a centerpiece of the cookbook is the homestead fried chicken recipe. So that true Southern, a restaurant that even if you didn't grow up here, you hear about, you've heard of. Every time I say that, I can hear cookbooks flying off the shelf because that was a really important recipe for us to get because it's so ingrained. Not only just because it's part of, my family went there for special occasions, but it's part of our community's history. It's a historic building. The founder of the homestead, Alpha Painter, was a force to be reckoned with in our community. And we reached out, and Katie designs all of our exhibits. We reached out to her for this cookbook because she also has a tie-in with our culinary community now at the beach. Her husband is Chef Greg, and they own Gregory Paul's. So they really helped us with identifying some key recipes and making some of the recipes for us for our exhibit kickoff.
So, Katie, what about the design? I mean, what were you hoping to do? As I'm looking at the cover, which shows some recognizable places that I've been to, and it just did a film shoot at the old hotel out there, and I guess that pool isn't there anymore. So,
well, we were looking just to make it more user friendly and to highlight the certain recipes that we selected. So, and I think when you look in it, and then you'll be captured by the photos. There's a lot of historical photos
yes,
that we've used.
I'm opening right up to some of them, and again, my dad used to have a lot of photos of the hotel he was at and all the famous people that came through, and now I'm seeing places I didn't even know existed and others that I did. But marinated eggplant, Lucy Michler, I don't know how to say that. Michler's relish. There's Menorcan gopher stew. And of course, gopher tortoise you can't get. So you got to find out.
There is a disclaimer at the bottom with recommendations on alternates. And I will say Katie is always so wonderfully attentive to the look and feel of the Beaches Museum. She really gets it in terms of how we put our historical photos together and things like that. But she was very patient with us on this, in this case, because we were chasing down recipes. And in fact, we kept pushing back the cookbook launch because we had certain recipes we wanted to get, we wanted to keep going after. So that's why we will be launching it this Friday. The party is called Cocktails and Cookbook. So we're going to feature some of the cocktails from the book, including my favorite. I'm excited about this too, the Lemon Bar Freeze. And we're going to also have the Ziggy Fuddpuckers, which is famous at Ginger's Bar. So we're going to be whipping up some cocktails, some non-alcoholic options, the Skull Family Wedding Punch, and serving those as people come and pick up their pre-ordered cookbooks. And then after that, they'll be available for sale at the museum.
All right. Well, I want to thank Mayor Chris Hoffman and I'm sorry, total brain fade here. And Katie Ryder for being here. That's our program. We encourage your feedback and suggestions. Send either to firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. If you missed anything, catch the rebroadcast at 8 p.m. or find our entire archive at wjct.org or on your favorite podcast platform. Thanks to First Coast Connect for executive producer David Luckin, producer Stacey Bennett, Brady Corum, Jamie Valet, our associate producer. And don't forget, patience dwindles as negotiations between Florida's largest healthcare provider and insurance behemoth remain deadlocked, and that is tomorrow morning's show. I'm Dan Scanlon for Ann Schindler. You've been listening to First Coast Connect on WJCT News 89.9.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided by Baptist Health and the North Florida TPO.
Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at